This is Toronto, the largest city in Canada, the financial capital of the country, and one of the most important hubs in all of North America. To many people, it's all just one big city. But the reality is that for most of its history, Toronto was actually 6 municipalities in one. But when the provincial government decided to merge them in 1998, against the explicit wishes of the people who lived there, it set off a chain of political consequences that Canada is still living with today. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to 1954. Because what existed before wasn't chaos. It was actually a reasonably sophisticated system. See, Metropolitan Toronto was created in 1954 by the Ontario Provincial Government, a regional authority designed to coordinate infrastructure across the city of Toronto and 12 other surrounding municipalities. By 1967, as post-war growth filled in the gaps between them, those 13 were consolidated into 6. The City of Toronto, North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, York, and East York. The architect of the whole thing was Frederick Gardner, the first Metro chairman, who presided over a post-war building boom that turned the mid-sized Canadian city into a genuinely major one. By the early 1990s, Metro Toronto was considered one of the best-governed city regions in North America. Urban planners from around the world came to study it, and the 6 municipalities beneath it had real, distinct qualities. The City of Toronto, what people now call Old Toronto, was the dense, progressive urban core, home to arts, culture, streetcars, and a long tradition of civic-minded politics. North York, just to the north, was the most populous of the 6, over 560,000 people, and for 25 years it had been shaped almost entirely by one man, Mel Lastman, who had turned it into what he called a world-class city, complete with its own downtown on the Yonge and Sheppard corridor. Scarborough to the east was heavily suburban, post-war residential with a fierce local identity and a long history of feeling looked down upon by downtown Toronto. Etobicoke to the west was a mix of industrial areas, suburbs, and waterfront. York was the smallest and poorest of the 6, heavily dependent on Metro Cross subsidies. And East York, a borough technically, not a city, was the tightest knit of all, a post-war working-class community with bungalows and block associations and a quiet pride that ran very deep. These weren't just administrative lines on a map, these were real communities. So, what changed? Well, in 1995, a man named Mike Harris won the Ontario provincial election on a platform called the Common Sense Revolution. The goal? Slash spending, cut income taxes by 30%, and eliminate an $11 billion deficit. There'd be fewer politicians, less government, and more efficiency. And Toronto, with its 6 mayors, 6 councils, and 2 layers of government, looked like an obvious target. But Harris actually inherited a problem. The previous New Democratic Party government under Bob Rae had already seen that Metro Toronto's governance needed rethinking, and had appointed consultant Anne Golden to lead a task force on the future of the Greater Toronto Area. The Golden Report landed in January 1996, and had pointed in almost the exact opposite direction from what Harris wanted. Golden's argument was simple. Toronto's real problems didn't stop at the Metro's borders. If you actually wanted to deal with sprawl, housing, and regional transit, merging the 6 inner municipalities wasn't enough. You had to think much bigger. Her recommendation was to create a true Greater Toronto government, one that pulled in the fast-growing outer suburbs too, Mississauga, Brampton, Vaughan, Markham. Because in her view, it wasn't that Metro Toronto was too divided on the inside, it was that the suburbs exploding beyond it had no meaningful connection to the regional core. But Harris rejected this entirely. Instead, he did the opposite. He merged the 6 inner municipalities into one city, while leaving the outer suburbs completely untouched. Mississauga, with 550,000 people, stayed independent. Brampton stayed independent. The sprawl problem Golden had identified was left to grow unchecked. Instead of going bigger as had been recommended, Premier Harris chose to go smaller, and specifically inward, leaving his political base in the outer suburbs untouched. The stated justification was a study from December 1996 by KPMG, a Big Four global accounting firm, that projected savings of $865 million over its first 3 years from merging the 6 cities. It would eliminate duplicate administrations, consolidate purchasing, and streamline service delivery. Everything would be more cost-efficient, basically. The math on paper looked clean, but the real motivations were more interesting than that. It involved making sure you're subscribed to the channel. No, but anyways. The first was financial. Harris's government was simultaneously restructuring which level of government paid for what, known as disentanglement. The province took control of education funding, which it pitched as a win for Toronto taxpayers. But what it didn't advertise was what the cost was in return. Social housing, welfare, childcare subsidies, long-term care, and ambulances were downloaded onto the new city. Toronto inherited roughly 95,000 aging social housing units, with a repair backlog estimated at over $2 billion. The net annual cost of this download to the new city was around $252 million every year, according to Toronto's own budget analysis. That number has been cited by every Toronto mayor since. Basically, Harris used the restructuring as cover to transfer costs from the province's books to the city's books. The second motive, documented extensively in the academic literature, was political. Old Toronto consistently voted Liberal or New Democratic in provincial and federal elections. Merging it into a single megacity meant that the suburban wards, more conservative in character, would dilute the concentrated urban progressive vote that had made Old Toronto such an effective thorn in the provincial government side. To many, it was a form of gerrymandering, and the people that were being merged didn't exactly accept it quietly. December 1996, Bill 103, the City of Toronto Act, is introduced in the Ontario legislature. A month later, public hearings had generated thousands of submissions. A coalition called Citizens for Local Democracy, led by John Sewell, a former Toronto mayor, began organizing across all 6 cities. The argument was simple: Metro Toronto already works. This is a solution in search of a problem. On the other side, a group called Save Our Suburbs emerged in North York and Etobicoke, suburban homeowners who feared that downtown Toronto's higher taxes and service model would be imposed on them. And here's something worth noting. The downtown progressives and the suburban conservatives both opposed this, for completely opposite reasons. The only constituency that actually wanted amalgamation was the provincial government. In January 1997, roughly 10,000 people rallied at Metro Hall, one of the largest municipal protests in Toronto's history. On March 3, 1997, the 6 municipalities held a referendum. The question: are you in favor of amalgamation? 76% of residents voted no. Not even a single municipality had a positive percentage vote. Meanwhile, Premier Mike Harris's response was, the referendum is not binding. He had a point though, legally. Under Canadian Constitution, municipalities are creatures of the province. Section 92(8) of the Constitution Act 1867 gives provinces total authority over municipal institutions. And the courts agreed. Ontario could do whatever it wanted to Toronto. And there was no constitutional protection, no recourse. In the legislature, the NDP and Liberals filed approximately 13,000 amendments to Bill 103 over 9 days in an attempt to delay it, one of the longest filibuster efforts in Ontario history. The government eventually invoked closure, cutting off debate and sending it through. So on April 21, 1997, Bill 103 passed, and on January 1, 1998, the City of Toronto was officially born. The transition was, to put it charitably, bumpy. Mal Lastman, who had spent 25 years building North York and called amalgamation a disaster right up until it became inevitable, reversed course and ran for mayor of the new city. He won, defeating Barbara Hall, the incumbent City of Toronto mayor, largely on North York suburban votes. The first election of the new city perfectly previewed the political dynamics that would define it for decades. The harmonization problem was severe. 6 municipalities had 6 different wage scales, 6 different benefit packages, 6 different service standards. Under labor law and political reality, everything had to be harmonized upward, to the highest standard in each category. If Etobicoke's libraries were open fewer hours than Toronto's, Etobicoke's libraries now kept Toronto city hours, at Toronto Metro's cost. This happened across thousands of service lines. The KPMG savings simply never materialized. The Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto published a definitive 20-year retrospective and found no credible evidence that amalgamation reduced costs. The Fraser Institute, a conservative think tank not exactly friendly to big government, found no tangible financial benefit from amalgamation. In 2011, then-Mayor Rob Ford hired KPMG to find what he called gravy, his term for waste in the city budget. They looked everywhere. They found almost nothing. The same firm that had justified amalgamation on savings grounds now essentially confirmed that the merged city had no obvious efficiencies left to find. That brings us to Rob Ford, and you can't really understand Rob Ford without understanding what amalgamation did to the city's politics. Post-amalgamation, the former suburban municipalities felt they had traded something real, responsive local government, for a seat at a table dominated by downtown Toronto's priorities, media, and culture. The Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, CBC, all headquartered downtown, all culturally downtown. In Scarborough especially, the long decline of the Scarborough Rapid Transit reinforced the sense that suburban transit needs were being neglected. Rob Ford grew up in Etobicoke and was first elected to council in 2000 for Etobicoke North. His entire political brand, the suburban taxpayer against downtown elites and gravy, was a direct expression of this resentment. His attacks on libraries, on arts funding, on streetcars, these were coded attacks on downtown priorities. And they worked. When he won the 2010 mayoral election, the electoral map told the whole story. Downtown voted overwhelmingly against him. Etobicoke and Scarborough put him over the top. It was a map of amalgamation's fault lines made visible. And then there's Doug Ford, Rob's brother. He became Premier of Ontario. 2 months into his term, in the middle of an active Toronto municipal election campaign, with candidates already on the ballot, he announced he was cutting Toronto City Council from 47 seats to 25. Mid-election. No consultation. An Ontario court struck it down as unconstitutional, violating freedom of expression. Ford threatened to use the notwithstanding clause, which would have been the first time in Ontario history, but the election proceeded under his 25-ward map anyway. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld it in 2021, 5-4, confirming the province's sweeping constitutional authority over municipalities. Today, Toronto now has 25 councillors for over 3 million people, one per roughly 120,000 residents. Compare that to Paris, or London boroughs, one local councillor per 5,000. San Francisco has 11 supervisors for 800,000 people. By almost any measure, Toronto is among the least democratically represented major cities on Earth. And it got there through a straight line from Bill 103 in 1997 to Bill 5 in 2018. The same doctrine, the same logic, the same province telling the same city that its wishes are advisory. In fact, it gets crazier when you compare it to what happened in Montreal. In 2002, Quebec's provincial government did almost exactly what Harris had done, merged 28 municipalities on the island of Montreal into a single city, under the same justification and efficiency promises. But Quebec law allowed something Ontario's didn't, a de-amalgamation mechanism, a provision for municipalities to hold referendums and leave if they wanted. In 2004, 15 municipalities voted to leave. In 2006, they reformed as separate cities. Toronto was never given that option. They refused to legislate a path for de-amalgamation. The province merged it. Only the province can unmerge it. And the province has never seriously considered doing so. Quebec gave its citizens a way out. Ontario didn't. And the problem that amalgamation was actually supposed to solve, the regional coordination problem, the sprawl problem that Anne Golden had correctly identified, was never addressed at all. Mississauga stayed independent. Brampton stayed independent. The outer suburbs kept growing outward, approving low-density subdivisions, generating car-dependent sprawl with no connection to Toronto's transit planning. The Greater Toronto Area still has no real unified transit system. GO Transit, TTC, York Region Transit, Brampton Transit, MyWay in Mississauga, all separate. The amalgamation merged the cities that didn't need merging and left untouched the suburban sprawl that actually needed to be governed differently. Today, Toronto's operating budget is $18.9 billion. Its social housing waitlist has over 105,000 households. Its infrastructure deficit, unfunded capital repairs needed over the next decade, is estimated at $46.5 billion Canadian dollars. The structural pressure from downloaded costs has never been resolved. Basically, every mayor since 1998 has gone to the province asking for relief, and they all come back largely empty-handed. The identities never faded. Scarborough, Etobicoke, North York, you still hear them constantly. Not as legal jurisdictions, but as real places where real people live and have strong opinions about whether they're being treated fairly. The borders may have gone in 1998, but the feelings didn't. After all, what do you think the nickname for Toronto that Drake popularized, yet most locals never refer to it as? The Six is really about, being a six-in-one city. What the Toronto amalgamation really was, under the efficiency of language and the KPMG projections, was a political decision. A decision about which level of government would bear the cost of an aging social housing stock during every recession. about which cities' voters would have their political influence diluted, about whether a democratic referendum was something the province actually had to respect. The courts said no to that last one, the constitution said no, and nearly 3 decades later, Toronto is still paying, literally and otherwise, for the answer. But on the other side of things, the general trend for growing cities is to amalgamate for efficiency, whether you agree with it or not. So to many, it was also inevitable, but the critique was that it was just rushed too soon. But what do you think about it? Was it even needed? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.